You're an embarrassment to this family, Fiona. Your sister is marrying into the Caldwell name, and you show up smelling like hospital antiseptic with dirt under your fingernails. Sit in the back. Don't speak to anyone. My mother's voice was barely above a whisper, but it landed harder than anything I'd ever heard through a trauma bay door. She reached over and plucked the invitation card from my coat pocket, the one I'd kept flat and unfolded for 3 weeks, turned it face down on the granite countertop, and slid a cheese knife across it like she was dismissing a room service bill. My sister Claire stood behind her, inspecting her manicure. She didn't look up. That was answer enough. I was still in my scrubs. I'd come straight from a 12-hour shift at Sunnybrook. I hadn't even had time to stop for coffee. My hands, the ones that had spent the last hour restarting a 62-year-old man's heart, were clean. I scrubbed them until the skin cracks. But my mother looked at them like they carried something contagious. My husband Marcus stood beside me. He's a plumber. Not a partner at a firm, not a portfolio manager, not a man with a trust fund or a summer property on Lake Joseph. He fixes the pipes that keep everyone else's houses from collapsing, and he does it without complaint, and he comes home every night with his knuckles split from cold water and old fittings. He had worn his best shirt. I noticed her eyes move over him exactly once, the way you check a price tag and put something back on the shelf. The Caldwells are old Toronto money, Fiona, my mother said, picking up her champagne. Nathaniel's family goes back 4 generations in this city. I cannot have the guests seeing that Claire's sister is she paused, chose her word carefully, a shift worker. It reflects on all of us. I didn't raise my voice. The ICU trained that out of me years ago. I said, I've been on my feet since 6 this morning, Mum. That was all I said. She didn't answer. She just looked at the invitation card and turned it another quarter rotation on the counter, like it was something she was deciding whether to keep. We drove home in Marcus's truck. The heater made a sound like something was loose in the vent. He kept both hands on the wheel and didn't say anything for a long time. Marcus is the kind of man who thinks before he speaks, genuinely thinks, which means sometimes 20 minutes pass before he says the thing that's exactly right. We were already on the 401 when he said, "You okay?" I looked at his hands. His left ring finger has a permanent groove from a wrench handle. His knuckles were red from the cold. I thought about all the houses in this city that had hot water tonight because of those hands. I thought about the 72-year-old woman in Etobicoke whose basement he'd replumbed for cost because she was on a fixed income and the pipes had burst in February and she had no one else to call. I didn't answer him right away. I was thinking about 8 years earlier. I was 26, 2 years into my residency, calling home from the hospital at 2 in the morning to tell my mother I'd just been accepted into a fellowship. Critical care, Toronto General, the kind of opportunity that comes once. She'd been quiet for a moment and then she said, Claire got an interview at that events company downtown, the one that does galas. She's going to meet interesting people, Fiona. Real society people. She said that last sentence like it was the end of the conversation. Like my fellowship was something she'd glanced at and put back. I kept working. I always kept working. Claire married Nathaniel Caldwell in a ceremony at a venue in Rosedale that cost more than my annual salary. 400 guests, string quartet, the kind of flower arrangements that have their own lighting. My mother had been planning it for 2 years, maybe longer, maybe since the day Nathaniel first came to Christmas dinner, and she'd nearly knocked over the centerpiece rushing to refill his glass. Marcus and I drove back to our house in Scarborough. It's a semi-detached we bought 6 years ago. The trim needs repainting. One of the gutters has a slow sag on the east side that Marcus keeps meaning to fix and keeps getting called away from. I love that house. I love it the way you love something you actually earned. He made tea. I sat at the kitchen table in my scrubs and I thought about the last thing my mother had said as we were leaving. She'd walked us to the door, which surprised me, but then she'd pressed a folded piece of paper into my hand. I thought for a moment it was something kind, an apology maybe, a note. I opened it in the truck. It was a dry cleaning receipt. Her words were written across the back in her careful cursive. If you're going to insist on coming to family events, at least dress like you belong there. Marcus read it over my shoulder. He took it gently out of my hand, folded it back the way it was, and put it in the glove box without a word. The tendons in his jaw were working. I know that look. I've seen it twice in 12 years. Once when a contractor tried to cheat him on materials. Once when his father died. I pressed my thumbnail into my palm and made a decision that settled over me like the quiet after a code. No more. Not one more receipt, one more look, one more careful arrangement of words designed to remind me of my place. What my mother didn't know, what no one in that family knew, what I had never once spoken aloud outside of a locked review room, was what had happened 4 years earlier. It was February, the coldest stretch of that winter. I was working nights in the trauma bay at Sunnybrook when they brought in a man with no wallet, no ID, and a cardiac arrest in progress. He'd been found outside a parking garage on Yonge Street. Nobody had stopped. He'd been on the pavement for at least 6 minutes before a university student called 911 and stayed with him, which is the only reason there was anything left to work with when he came through our doors. I ran the resuscitation for 40 minutes. There are always moments in a long code where you look at the numbers and the body and you know what a reasonable person would decide. My senior colleague called time of death at 38 minutes. I said, give me 2 more. Not because I had a medical reason that would hold up to scrutiny on paper. Because something in the rhythm of him felt like it was waiting. Like there was someone still in there pressing against the glass. He came back at minute 41. He spent 3 weeks in the ICU. I was not his most responsible physician after that night. There are protocols, but I checked his chart every morning, and when he was moved to step down, I stopped by his room. He was sitting up. He had the posture of a man who had spent his whole life in rooms where other people paid attention when he walked in. His name was Alistair Drummond. He'd been in the city for a private meeting that ran late. His security detail had been waiting at the wrong parking structure. He was, I learned later, the kind of man whose name appeared on buildings, whose opinion could shift a zoning decision or redirect a municipal contract. He'd built half the affordable housing projects in the lower city over 30 years, quietly, without holding press conferences. His foundation funded 2 of the nursing residency programs at our hospital. He shook my hand with both of his when I came to say goodbye on his discharge day, and he said, I'm told you were the reason. I told him I was doing my job. He looked at me for a long moment and said, no, you were doing something more than that. I asked for nothing. I told no one. I went back to nights. The day after Claire's wedding, Marcus and I were home. He was replumbing the bathroom on the 2nd floor, a weekend project we'd been putting off. And I was at the kitchen table reading when my phone rang. Unknown number with a 416 area code. I almost didn't pick up. The voice on the other end was a woman. Her name was Lynette. She said she was calling on behalf of Alistair Drummond, who had, she said, just learned what had happened at the Caldwell-Whitmore wedding the previous day. I didn't understand at first, she explained. Nathaniel Caldwell, Claire's new husband, was in the early stages of closing a major commercial development partnership with the Drummond Foundation. A partnership worth, she said carefully, somewhere in the neighborhood of $40 million, Mr. Drummond had learned through channels that the physician who had resuscitated him 4 years ago was the sister of the woman who had just married into the Caldwell family, and that she had been, the word she used was discouraged, from attending. Drummond wanted to meet me that afternoon, if possible. He was hosting a private dinner at the Royal Ontario Museum for the Foundation's board and key partners, including Nathaniel Caldwell's family, including my mother. I said I'd have to change out of my clothes. Lynette said, please come as you are. I didn't. I went upstairs and put on the only formal thing I own that isn't a conference blazer. A dress I'd bought for Marcus's cousin's wedding 3 years ago, deep green, simple. I pinned my hospital ID to the lapel, not as a statement, because I'd worn it every day for the last 12 years and it felt wrong to walk into that room without it. Marcus watched me from the doorway of the bathroom. He had a pipe wrench in his hand and plumber's tape stuck to his forearm. He raised both eyebrows. Alistair Drummond, I said. He was quiet for a second. Then he said, the hospital guy? The hospital guy. He nodded once, set the wrench down on the toilet tank with a soft metal sound. You want me to drive you? I kissed him on the cheek and left him standing in the hallway with plumber's tape on his arm. The ROM at dusk in winter is something. The stone and glass hold the last of the light and everything inside goes amber. The foyer was already filled with the specific kind of quiet that comes with real money. Not loud, not performative, just a deep settled assurance that everything in the room was exactly where it was supposed to be. I walked through the door and found the event room on my own. I had the distinct feeling of walking into a space that wasn't expecting me. It was expecting me. My mother saw me from across the room. She was standing with a group of women I didn't recognize, holding a wine glass, and the color left her face in a way I'd only seen once before. At my father's funeral, when the reality of it hit her in the middle of the receiving line. She didn't move. Claire gripped Nathaniel's arm and leaned close to say something to him. Nathaniel's face did not change expression, but his eyes tracked me from the doorway to the center of the room in a way that told me the calculus had already started running. Alistair Drummond stood at the far end of the room near the windows. He was in his mid-70s, white-haired, the kind of lean that comes from a long life of physical work and modest eating. He walked toward me without the cane I'd seen in his discharge photo, which I took as a good sign. He stopped 2 feet away and looked at me the same way he had from the hospital bed. Dr. Fiona, he said. He didn't say my last name, he didn't need to. He shook my hand with both of his again. I noticed the room had gone quiet in the particular way rooms do when someone who matters has directed their full attention somewhere unexpected. He turned to face the room without letting go of my hand and said, in a voice that carried without effort, I want to introduce someone. 4 years ago, on a February night on Yonge Street, this woman kept her hands on my chest for 41 minutes and refused to let me go. He paused. Let that sit. She asked for nothing afterward. She didn't call my office. She didn't leverage it. She went back to her shift. The room was absolutely still. The Drummond Foundation has spent 30 years looking for partners who understand what it means to invest in a community without expecting a return on the vanity. I've been looking for the right way to say thank you to this woman for 4 years. He turned and looked directly at my mother. I understand she wasn't invited yesterday. My mother's hand tightened around the wine glass. Drummond released my hand and gestured toward the head table. Fiona, please sit with me. I sat. I watched my mother from across the room, the woman who had handed me a dry cleaning receipt as an apology. The woman who had told me I smelled like a hospital and needed to sit in the back. The woman who had spent 2 years engineering a wedding to attach our family to the Caldwell name, who had recalibrated every conversation for the last decade toward Claire's social ascent, who had looked at my husband's cracked knuckles once and decided he wasn't worth remembering. She was watching Nathaniel. And Nathaniel was watching Drummond. And the expression on Nathaniel's face was the expression of a man who is very quietly redoing arithmetic and not liking the answer. Drummond leaned toward me and said quietly, I should tell you. He came to me 6 months ago looking for foundation backing on a residential project in the East End. Good project, honestly. But I told my team I needed to meet the family first. Character due diligence, I called it. He smiled. I learned a great deal about the family. After dinner, as the room was beginning to shift into the standing around part of the evening, Claire found me near the window. She looked exactly as she had at our mother's counter the day before, composed, careful, managed. But there was something underneath it now that hadn't been there. She said, You could have told us. About Drummond. About what you did. I thought about that for a moment. About the residency at 2 a.m, about the dry cleaning receipt. About the 100 other small moments that had accumulated over 20 years into something that looked, from the outside, like a family, but felt, from the inside, like a performance I kept being asked to leave. I said, Would it have mattered? She didn't answer. That was the most honest thing that had passed between us in years. I said, I didn't save him for a return, Claire. I didn't do my job expecting a thank you dinner. That's not. I stopped. Started again. You and Mum have spent so long sorting people into what they're worth. I don't know how to explain to you what it feels like to not do that. She looked at her hands. The ring was enormous. It caught the light from the museum cases on the far wall. I said, I hope Nathaniel is a good man. And I meant it. My mother found me by the coat check. She'd had enough wine to move through the careful architecture of her composure. She reached for my arm, and I took a small step back, not dramatic, just enough. Fiona. Her voice cracked on the first syllable, which startled me. I'd never heard that before. I didn't know. I didn't know what you'd done. If I had known, I said, if you'd known, it would have been about that, about what I was worth to you because of what I'd done. She blinked. I said, I need you to understand that I needed you to see my worth when I was just a shift worker coming home tired. Not now. Not because Alistair Drummond held my hand in front of a room full of people. She pressed her lips together. The mascara was doing what mascara does. I said, I love you. I'm your daughter, and I love you. But I'm going home now, and I'm going to make tea with my husband, and I'm going to need some time before we talk again. She said, the Caldwell Project. I said, that's between Nathaniel and the foundation, Mum. I have nothing to do with it. And I'm not going to. I got my coat. I walked out through the main doors and down the front steps into the February cold, and I called Marcus. He answered on the second ring. The sound of the hockey game was in the background. He'd gone home after dropping me off and apparently decided to watch the Leafs. Very Marcus. He said, how'd it go? I said, I'll tell you on the way home. Come get me. He was there in 22 minutes. He pulled up in the truck, the heater rattling the way it always does, and I got in and the cab smelled like the same thing it always smells like. Coffee and plumber's tape. And his particular combination of aftershave and honest work, and I put my head back against the headrest and exhaled for what felt like the first time in 36 hours. He didn't ask anything. He pulled out into the street and drove. The CN Tower slid past the window, lit up in the dark. After a few blocks, he said, You eat anything? I said, fancy appetizers. He said, I've got chili on the stove. And that was that. I need to tell you what happened afterward because it didn't end with the dinner. Nathaniel's team had been in due diligence with the Drummond Foundation for 6 months. 2 weeks after the ROM dinner, the Foundation's board completed their review. They issued a statement announcing a significant community housing partnership, not with Caldwell Property Holdings, but with a mid-sized developer out of Hamilton who had a 15-year track record of delivering on affordability commitments. Nathaniel was not named. He was not publicly embarrassed. But the contract he had expected, the one that was going to reshape his portfolio and give him the kind of foundation backing that lends credibility to everything that comes after, went to someone else. Drummond sent me a note on foundation letterhead, handwritten at the bottom, in the margin. The Hamilton firm has a good doctor on their advisory board. I checked. That was all. Claire called twice in the weeks after. The first call was tense, clipped, about logistics, Christmas, my mother's birthday, the usual calendar negotiation. The second call was different. She called on a Tuesday night and she cried. Not performed crying, not the useful kind, the real kind, where you don't have any words that work and you just stay on the line and breathe. I stayed on the line. I didn't fix anything. I didn't tell her what she should have done or who she should have been. I just held the phone and let her work through it, because that's what you do for a sister, even when it's complicated, even when the history between you is full of receipts and invitations turned face down on granite counters. My mother took longer. She texted. Then she called and left voicemails. Then she sent a card, a real one, the kind with a stamp, which meant she had thought about it for longer than a moment. I read the card 3 times. She said she was sorry. She said it plainly, without conditions, which was new. She said she had been measuring things by the wrong ruler for a long time, and that she knew it and that she was going to try to stop. I wrote back, a letter, not a text, 3 pages. I said things I'd been carrying for 20 years, and I said them as clearly as I could, without cruelty, without the satisfaction of landing the blow. I told her about the residency call, about the fellowship that went unacknowledged, about the dry cleaning receipt, about all the ways she had sorted Marcus into a column and left him there. She called me after she received it. She didn't defend herself. She listened, and then she said, I want to meet Marcus properly, if he'll have me. He would have her. Of course he would. That's who Marcus is. That dinner took 3 months to arrange, and it was awkward and imperfect. And my mother overcooked the salmon, and Marcus ate 2 helpings anyway, without being asked. And I sat at that table watching them make cautious conversation about hockey and plumbing permits, and the price of avocados in December. And I thought, this is what repairing something actually looks like. Not a grand gesture. Not a room full of people watching someone be recognized. Just 3 adults at a kitchen table in Scarborough, trying. The strongest thing I ever did was not the 41 minutes in that trauma bay, though I am glad for every one of them. The strongest thing I did was refuse to vanish. When someone told me I didn't fit the picture they were trying to paint, I kept showing up. I kept doing the work. I kept loving the people who deserved it and holding the door for the ones who were still figuring out how. The work was never going to look glamorous from the outside. That's not what it's for. It's for the person on the gurney who still has a chance. It's for the houses in this city that need their pipes to hold through a Canadian winter. It's for the Tuesday night phone calls that go on too long and say everything by saying almost nothing. If this story made you think about someone in your life you've let sort you into the wrong column, someone who decided what you were worth before they knew who you were, hit that like button and tell me about them in the comments. Because the people in this community understand something the Wineglass crowd doesn't. The truest measure of a person has never once fit on a guest list.